It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. Okay, I'm very excited about today's show. Our guest is named Scott Kaiser. His dad was Edwin Benjamin Kaiser. Was referred to sometimes as the sixth Watergate burglar. Friends with Luis Posada, Frank Sturgis, and that whole kind of Operation 40, Bay of Pigs, Watergate burglars, and Kennedy assassins bunch that we've talked about so much here on the show. So we have Scott Kaiser with us. He's the son of Edwin Benjamin Kaiser. And this is pretty much an exclusive interview, too. What he's going to tell us today, he says he hasn't told anyone before. And I think after this interview, he doesn't want to talk to anybody after this. Maybe he won't want to talk to me before we're done. But Scott Kaiser, are you there?
I am.
Thank you so much. Tell us about yourself. Before we get into your dad, who is Scott Kaiser?
Well, Scott Kaiser is nobody but the son of Edwin Kaiser. And I was born in Norwalk, Connecticut, raised in Miami, traveled pretty much all over the United States. My sister was born in Alaska. And now I reside in San Antonio, Texas. I owned my own business called Kaiser Industries, or Kaiser Industries Painting Company, incorporated in San Antonio, where we had more than 60 employees working for us. Sold my business, and now I'm happily retired.
Yeah, those are the days, right? So
Yes, sir.
Give us an idea then. Who was your dad? Edwin Benjamin Kaiser.
That is an excellent question, because I didn't know who my dad was until 8-9 years ago, when I decided to do some digging while my mother was visiting her sister in California. And as I was going through my mother's hope chest, I came across about 1.5 inch, maybe 2 inch thick papers of some FOIA documents I'd never seen before, and a book by A.J. Weberman, who he had given my mother back in the early or middle part of the 1970s. And so it just caught my eye, because I was actually looking for photographs just to hang up on the wall. And as I was going through these documents, I decided not to go through the photos. And I discovered that my father was somebody he had not ever mentioned to me about while I was a child. He did things I don't think my mother, my father, my sister or I ever really knew he did. He had worked in Watergate. He was recruited by Frank Sturgis as one of the 6 burglars. In fact, he was one of the third guys of the 3 people that walked in to Richardson's photo labs on Flagler Street when Bernard Barker went to go get the photos printed from the photos that they took up in Washington, D.C. And if you ever read the testimony from Richardson to the FBI, he was actually describing my father as the third person that walked in to get these photos printed. Anyways.
Well, let me ask you a question quick. Now, was your dad there the night of the arrest?
No. He only went one time to Washington, D.C. And there was, I believe, a total of 4 break-ins that occurred prior to the arrests. So the night that they all got arrested, June 17th, the next day, it hit headlines in the Miami Herald. My dad just took off to Mike McClaney's hotel in Haiti, where he was invited by Mike to go hang out, just lay low for a while. And the FBI could never really bring him in for questioning because he was somewhere else.
Did his name ever come up in the Watergate hearings?
Yes. He actually was subpoenaed to go to the hearings, and the government paid his airplane ticket and, a round-trip ticket for him to go testify behind closed doors. Let me back up. He went to go testify, but he wouldn't testify. He didn't want to open up to what he knew, and what he said was that I had already told his side of the story to a person that was on the Watergate panel, and it was behind closed doors, and that person was Howard Leavengood. Howard Leavengood came down to Miami after my father went to Washington, D.C., and he opened up to Leavengood, but not before he told people in Washington that he wasn't going to open up or testify at an open session.
Now, what about Douglas Caddy, the attorney for the Watergate burglars? Was he aware of your dad? Did he ever mention your dad in public?
No, I don't think anybody knew anything about my dad. Nobody knew that he was actually the sixth burglar. Frank didn't rat him out. Hunt didn't rat him out. Barker didn't rat him out. Nobody ratted out my dad. To this day, I can't figure out why. But yeah, nobody really knew about my dad.
And you mentioned that AJ sent your mother a book. Was that Coup d'etat in America?
Yes, it was. That's the book.
Okay, and did he mention about your dad being involved in Watergate, or he was just focused on the JFK assassination?
A little of both. AJ, in fact, wrote a letter to the government or FOIA document to see if he couldn't receive more information on my dad. AJ was the only investigator at that time who knew anything about my dad, and in fact, he told me a story about my dad helping AJ out at one time where there was something that was going down at Flamingo Park, and Nixon was supposed to be assassinated there. And so my dad backed out of that assassination plot and told AJ, or gave AJ a few things. It gave him some information about the Flamingo plot assassination, but there wasn't no shootout that happened. And then I guess AJ went to Hemming for some more information.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that, too, because you do mention also, too, that your dad was involved in assassination plots against Nixon and Kissinger. And I'd also be interested, too, in how your dad came into contact with AJ. But even more, I'd like to do this in more of a chronological fashion, because I guess your dad was the first thing of interest would be his involvement with the Bay of Pigs and all that anti-Castro gun running and stuff before Castro took over. Am I correct?
Well, yes and no. My dad wasn't involved in the Bay of Pigs. He was in 1961. He was stationed in Alaska, and he was infiltrating the U.S. Army in Alaska, stealing gasoline and identification cards and secret documents and stuff like that at Fort Richardson's Air Force Base in Alaska. Then after Alaska, he came down.
But wait a second. He was stationed with the CIA, stealing information from the Army?
No. He had just gotten out of the French Foreign Legion.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he was in the French Foreign Legion. He had just gotten out of the French Foreign Legion. The CIA is when they took notice of my father after getting out of the French Foreign Legion, and when he came over to the United States. He then went to Alaska, and that's when he started impersonating himself as a military officer, a sergeant in the U.S. Army, and they called him Sarge at the time. And he was walking in and out of the Air Force Base in Alaska, and he was then stealing documents, gasoline, all kinds of things while he was there. Then in 1962 is when he, after the Cuban Missile Crisis broke out, is when he was in Connecticut, but at that time also traveled to Miami, Florida. And my grandmother, who decided to leave Connecticut, moved to Miami, Florida. And that's when my father helped my grandmother move down here. Now, she owned a company called the Mervyn Seed Company, who prior to Fidel Castro sold a lot of exotic tropical plants to the Cuban government. And so she and her husband, my step-grandfather, would fly to Cuba prior to the Castro regime. And sell their seeds, and it's all in the newspaper, and their company went under after the Castro regime took over, and they pretty much lost everything. So it was something for my father to I guess get himself involved into with the anti-Castro community, and that's when it all started for him in 1962.
Okay, that makes sense. But I'm curious, though, when he was stealing the gasoline and the phony ID up there in Alaska, who was he selling it to? Who was financing that operation?
Oh, he was selling it. He was selling the gasoline to the local natives in Alaska who needed gas to keep warm, or because they couldn't afford gas for their vehicles. People who needed fuel for cooking, for anything. And so my father would steal 55-gallon drums of gas a day and just either sell it or give it away to the local people in Alaska who needed fuel.
And who would he sell the ID and the paperwork to?
That he kept.
That he kept for himself. Okay, interesting. So he was just pretty much a freelancer kind of operator kind of guy doing petty crime.
Yeah,
okay.
Basically.
Okay, then he gets pissed off at Castro because, the seed business goes down. Then what happens next? He starts hooking up with the anti-Castro guys?
Well, not only did the seed business go down, but his stepfather had just passed away, and he was closest to his stepfather than he was to his real dad. So his mother had moved to Lakewood, Florida, and at that time he decided to move down just after my sister. Well, we were traveling back and forth, but my sister was born in Alaska in 1968, so we were going back and forth from Alaska to Connecticut to Florida. So my dad was always on the road and really never at home. But after my sister's birth is when we all decided to move into Florida. So he took the family in 1968, moved us in Florida, and in 1969 he was already plotting the assassination of Papa Doc.
For who?
The CIA and for the Haitian community.
Do you know how he came into contact with the CIA?
He came into contact with the CIA in 1962, just after getting out of the French Foreign Legion and fighting for, I guess, expedition or to his visa to re-enter the United States. And his mother, my grandmother, wrote several letters to President Eisenhower, who Mimi Eisenhower answered one of her letters to get him moved back into the United States. And basically in her letter, she was saying that the State Department was doing all they could do. That's when they really took notice of my dad, to find out who it was he was and what he did.
And in his efforts to assassinate Papa Doc, what did he do?
I'm sorry, you were breaking up.
Yeah, I'm sorry. In his efforts to assassinate Papa Doc and Duvalier, what did he do?
Well, he first wrote up a plan of assassination, and he sent it to the Haitian community in Washington, D.C. that was approved. However, the American government didn't want any involvement, and it went from the Washington, D.C.'s approval to a Canadian Haitian group in Canada, and everything was approved and ready to go. They thought it was a wonderful plan. So he already knew how to speak 7 languages, and French was one of them, also being in the French Foreign Legion. So he often would visit Haiti, and he even was arrested in Haiti, and I believe in 1971 by Papa Duck's government. And that's the time when Papa Duck and his government was questioning my father as to what his intentions were on the island. And at that time, my father said that he was looking for people to recruit to infiltrate Cuba, and so they needed men or manpower for that purpose.
And you know this from reading your father's diaries and letters and that kind of thing?
Not just that, but questioning people in Miami. I've talked to Tony Caladayu, who was very close to my father. I talked to Frank Castro. I've talked to Luis Posada. I've talked to Eugenio Martinez, Jose Pujol. These are all people that I later found out was also in my father's telephone book. So, yeah, after finding his FOIA documents and a book by A.J. Weberman, I also came across 2 telephone books that he had left behind. And so I decided to research all these names that were left in his phone book.
And these people were open and receptive to speak with you?
Yeah. Absolutely. They respected my father highly. They all knew who he was and what he did.
You know, that's interesting because, I hear this over and over again that these people, they do talk. They talk to other people. You'd think with this such a big operation that they would want to keep it more secret. You know what I'm saying? You'd think. Yeah.
Well, yeah, yes and no. I guess it depends on who it was that was working with these anti-Castro peoples, especially any Americans. Like Hemming, I don't know how much information he got from anti-Castro people, but, he certainly didn't do, many of the things that my father did. And, Hemming stayed at our house for a week when he was already living in Opalaka, I believe it was. I guess he was out of his house. For whatever reason, I don't know. But he was at our house, and that's another story. While he was there, he ordered Soldier of Fortune magazines, and that's when my mother got a little pissed off that there was a guy living in our house, didn't want to work, ordering Soldier of Fortune magazines, and I guess it kind of pissed her off, so she told my father that he had to go. And so that's what happened with that. But, getting back to American people working for anti-Castro groups, it all depends on who you know and what you did. And if you proved yourself worthy working with them, and they trusted you as not just an American, but they knew that you were really anti-Castro, Castrolite is what they called them, people who really wanted to see Castro dead, they were more receptive to you, is what I'm looking for.
Yeah, I'm Cuban. I'm half Cuban, and my family was from Miami and stuff like that. I'm very familiar with all that kind of stuff.
Okay, well then you know what I'm talking about.
I know exactly what you're talking about. The thing is, too, your mother's still alive.
Yes, she is. I'm now taking care of her.
How does she feel about you talking about all this?
She never really wanted me to know anything about my dad. She was surprised when I found out. who he was and what he did. She told me stories about what had conspired at our house and things that had happened. But it took over 40 years for her to open up.
And when you were growing up and all this is going on and you have Jerry Hemming staying at your house, what did you think your dad did for a living?
He owned a junkyard. He took me out to this junkyard place where I later found out it was really a safe house or a safe place for CIA agents to meet there.
Sure.
But that's where Frank and Wilfredo Navarro and a lot of the guys would go, even in suits, and just hang out at a junkyard. And so I thought that's what he did, was own a junkyard.
And was there ever any kind of encouragement for him wanting you to follow in his footsteps and go into that kind of business? No, never.
No, none wwhatsoever. He never schooled me. He never taught me anything. He never opened up to me. It wasn't until the month before he was killed is when he opened up to me about a few things and played a recorded tape on my 13th birthday. That was the only time in my life that I had a feeling what was going on, but I didn't know.
And okay, so we might as well jump ahead a little bit. You believe your father was killed. The official story is he died in some kind of a boating accident?
The official story was that he fell through a hole in the deck where some wood boards broke, and the hole was approximately 25 to 30 feet above the bilge of the deck. And so the official story is that those boards broke because he walked across them and he broke his neck. And he fell wrong into the bilge of the deck, only 25 feet above, which I already knew was a lie my entire life since I was 13. My mother knew it. We all knew it. We all knew he was killed.
And what do you think the motive was for his murder, and who do you think did it?
Well, I know for a fact Frank Sturgis did it, along with Richard Poyle. There's no doubt about that whatsoever in my mind. The motive is because he had talked too much, and he started showing photographs around Miami, Florida, photographs that he had stolen from the CIA's headquarters in Miami Beach. In fact, that's where my father was killed, in Miami Beach. Just after JM Wave shut down in 1968, they had relocated and reopened new headquarters in Miami Beach, where they had moved everything. And my father had credentials. He had CIA credentials, FBI credentials, U.S. Customs credentials. He had credentials just about on every agency you can just about think of. And he infiltrated a lot of these agencies, and he, in fact, infiltrated U.S. Customs and stole some pink index cards that had information of the notorious drug dealers in Miami. And this was early on. That's how he became friends with Frank Castro and everybody else who was on those cards, because he just infiltrated these people and gained their trust and became friends with them over the years.
Do you think your dad was involved in any smuggling?
Drugs, yes.
Okay. And how can you be so sure that Sturgis was responsible for his murder?
Well, Frank was the guy who picked my father up, him and Richard Poyle, on the day of my father's death. And everybody was accounted for on that ship. Frank was even working with my father on the ship to renovate this ship, because it was a ship that they were planning on using to re-infiltrate Cuba with. and this was just after the Sunward Plan, which is another story. But everybody was accounted for on that ship except for Richard Poyle and Frank Sturgis, and they're the only two that were missing just after the death of my father.
Okay. Scott Kaiser, this may be a good time for us to take a commercial break, okay? When we get back, I'd like to get back on the timeline. I guess before I interrupted you so many times with questions, we were right around right about Bay of Pigs kind of stuff, the anti-Castro stuff, and then let's pick up around that time in your father's life. Well, with Scott Kaiser, he's the son of a fascinating character here, Edwin Benjamin Kaiser. Sixth Watergate burglar involved in assassination of John F. Kennedy. We're going to hear about an assassination against the Nixon and Kissinger plots as well. Friends with Frank Sturgis, Luis Posada, all those Operation 40 guys. Hey, was your dad involved too in the murder of Che Guevara?
No. He was not involved in the Che Guevara hunt down. That was Felix Rodriguez and Cubans who went to Bolivia. And another reason, Frank, I think, went after my father is that my father testified to Howard Liebengood, who Liebengood later started questioning Frank about the Flamingo Park incident and Nixon. So there was only one person that knew about that, and that was my father. And when Liebengood questioned Frank about that, Frank refuted my father's testimony and denied everything. Only one person knew about that, my father. Mm-hmm. And so that's another motive for Frank to have killed my father.
Yeah, and you mentioned, too, that your father was showing these photographs around. Was that part of a blackmail plot that your dad had going on?
Whether it was blackmail or to keep my father out of jail or for any financial gain, my father had photographs of Howard Hunt, Bernard Barker, Frank Sturgis, David Morales, and there was somebody else. I know there was 5 of them. Gordon Liddy. And they were outside just mulling around a motel in Dallas, Texas, on November 22nd, 1963. And the photographs were in black and white, and they were stamped on the reverse side, November 22nd, 1963. And this is a testimony that comes from Rudy Janko, who drove my father to the CIA where he stole the pictures.
Gotcha. Okay, so that's where the pictures are today. They were taken by Janko.
No, my father stole them. Rudy drove my father.
Oh.
And, Rudy just told me the story because he, along with Nino Diaz, Eugenio Martinez, Jose Pujol, others who have seen the photos, Tony Caladayu really opened up to me about the photos. But many of the Miami Cubans who are alive today had told me what those photos were, what they referred to, and why they're no longer around. Because the day that my father was killed, those photographs were in his attaché case, his briefcase, and after that, his briefcase went missing.
Okay. So, Scott, we were talking, I guess, about we guess we can call it the Cuban Revolution, Bay of Pigs period of time and your dad's involvement. What can you continue with there?
Okay. Well, in 1962 is when he first meets with Frank Sturgis, and they were flying some airplanes, I guess from Connecticut or Miami around the Caribbean. After that, the Cuban Missile Crisis had just started in October 28, 1962. That's when actually it became public or was made public to the nation that Castro had put missiles on the island from Russia. Mm-hmm. Prior to that, though, the first time Kennedy ever viewed the pictures was in Connecticut during his campaign run in 1962, and it was on October 17th that Jack was visiting Connecticut and was viewed or had viewed the photos of the missiles in Cuba. Then on the 19th of October, Jack had visited Chicago, and there, in one of the documents that I read from Howard Leavengood, it said that he had mentioned that a cousin by marriage or through marriage of my father, who was Congressman Donald Irwin, had written to 180,000 patriots in Connecticut about Jack viewing the photographs for the first time, and his Chicago trip was interrupted by a cold. And so I guess Jack stayed in Chicago for a day and left that evening on Air Force One. The story that I got from Luis Posada was that James McCord was head of Secret Service security, and he had visited Chicago, I believe, on October 17th or 18th, the day of or the day after Jack had left Chicago. And he had stolen some Secret Service credential badges. And those badges were actually given, one badge was given to Bernard Barker. And none of this was really detected until a year after the assassination, that Secret Service badges were ever stolen from the Secret Service station in Chicago. So my father, in 1963, moving forward somewhat, in 1963 was traveling all over the place. And my mother was 7 months pregnant with me. Her story is that my dad was supposed to have taken my mother to see her gynecologist on November 22nd, 1963. But he wasn't there to take my mother to go see her doctor. So, in fact, he was nowhere in sight the entire day or late that evening. He didn't get home until about midnight. And we were still living in Connecticut. So he gets in, walks into the door around midnight on November 22nd, 1963, and my mother asked my father if he had heard what had happened to Kennedy. And my father said that he looked at her. My mother said that he had looked at her and said, yeah, I hope they get that son of a whoever did it. Sorry for cussing, but these are his exact words. And he said, I hope they get the son of a b, whoever did it. That person doesn't deserve to live. And that was that.
And what did you ultimately discover your dad's role was that day?
Well, I don't know. We don't know. We just know that he wasn't there at the house. He didn't show up until midnight. And just a few days later, he went to Washington, D.C. to film the president's funeral. So what I did was I found that 8mm tape along with, of course, the documents, my father's address book and everything, all packed away in one box. And so I had that 8mm tape converted into a CD, and I posted it on YouTube, and I basically started questioning whether or not criminals ever really return to the scene of crime. And this has been something that's been mulling over in my head over and over and over, because the same people that were involved in Watergate seem to me to be the same people that were also involved in Jack's assassination.
Yeah, you mentioned Gordon Liddy. Now, I don't think I've ever heard of an allegation that Liddy was involved in the assassination.
Well, I heard stories.
Okay.
Whether or not how wild these stories are, I don't know. But I've tried contacting Gordon several times, even, just on a nice, friendly basis to ask him questions. Because if he knew anything about my dad being the sixth burglar, then he would have at least told me something.
Right.
But when I emailed him and I sent him information on Facebook about my dad having these photographs as well, he had shut down his Facebook account, and I started calling him at his radio station. And I left several messages for him to call me back. And the next thing I know, he also closed down his radio station. So it was pretty hard for me to try to get in contact.
Now, when you say your dad went and filmed the funeral, on whose behalf did he do that? On his own, for his own purposes, or was he paid?
I think it was just to have a trophy of whatever conspired that weekend. I think it was just something to a memorabilia, something to safekeep or something. Hard to explain. But,
no, I understand. But around that period,
my dad, it was just something to keep rather than just to go and do this.
But around that period of time, he had the money and the wherewithal and the spare time to get away from work and just travel from Connecticut down to D.C.?
Well, that's the thing. He didn't have a job. I find all this out through my mother. He never held a job, so I don't know where he got money from. And I know for a fact he did. I thought he had this wonderful job going over in the junkyard, but later I find out that he had no job. It was my mother who was supporting the family. So where he got his money from, we don't know. I can only surmise that most of it was through drug running in the Caribbean, because that's discussed in a lot of the FOIA documents. And, he was asking people about drugs being transported from the islands into the United States and drug boats and stuff. So I can only surmise and assume that that's what he was a part of. The next thing I know, my mother gets a brand new Buick Electra. My dad got his Lincoln Mach 4, and we got a brand new house in Hialeah. So, I don't know where all that money came from.
Yeah, you got to sell a lot of hubcaps, right, to come up with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, but through your research, now you've been investigating this for a huge portion of your life. What have you concluded he did that day? His involvement
in the assassination?
Yeah, his role that day.
I can only surmise and assume that his involvement was either transporting weapons or he was a shooter. Everybody went to my dad as the go-to guy when something needed to get done. And the CI already knew that he was a marksman or a sharpshooter while he was in the French Foreign Legion. That's what he was trained as. He early on knew Hunt and Sturgis, and so they all seemed to have problems with their stories as to where they were that day. I talked to James Hunt and also read his book, The Warrior, on Frank Sturgis, and James swears that his uncle was in Miami at the time of the assassination. And however, some of the stories that I get are conflicting. But then I also learned that James Dwyer, who followed my dad for the last part of his life, was also an FOIA document specialist writing up FOIA documents on the Kennedy assassination early on. And James Dwyer, who was FBI, went to Frank's house the next day after the assassination. And this is recorded, I don't know if it's in a newspaper or where, but I did find where Dwyer asked Frank or made the statement to Frank saying that if anybody could kill the president, it would be you. And all this is just basically recorded somewhere. So, I mean, this is not information I'm just pulling out of it.
No, I've heard all this before as well, yeah. And Sturgis was a pilot. He had access to many planes. He could have easily flown from anywhere. He wanted to fly in a few hours, so...
Well, yeah, and it was, I found a document, I don't know whether it was FBI or CIA, that Frank and Manuel Airtime were plotting to go to Dallas just 5 months, I think it was 4 or 5 months prior to Kennedy's assassination, looking for either airplane or airplane parts or something to that nature. And I've also posted that document in my PDF. And, you know, I'm thinking, why would Frank go to Dallas for an airplane or airplane parts when there were plenty of airplanes in Miami at that time?
Mm.
You know, and not only did Manuel Airtime know about the planes that were not being used or could be used, but so did Pedro Diaz-Lanz. And Pedro Diaz-Lanz was also a friend of my father's. And I had posted a picture of Pedro in his younger years with my dad standing outside, I think it was a mobile home trailer or something.
Now, there was also talk about that there was another potential assassination site was in Florida. Do you have any stories about that? Your dad might be involved in that or anything? Anything you can share?
Yeah, well, there was I think it was 1972 at Flamingo Park where President Nixon was going to give a speech about the VVAW, the Vietnam Veterans Against the War speech, and I believe he had just given one in New York a few days prior to that. So he was traveling around giving these speeches. Now, Nixon, I believe, was called off. Nixon called off his trip to Florida regarding the VVAW and sent Agnew in his place. And there was a guy by the name of Jose Boceto, Basulto, Boceto, Jose Boceto, who worked with my father on eliminating people. And so in a document I discovered, I also attached in my PDF where it says that Jose believed that he was there to assassinate President Agnew. So he didn't know what was going on. And this was a plot to assassinate President Nixon in Flamingo Park. And my dad was recruited by Frank, and the plot originated out of Frank's house. And he was talking about killing Nixon because they couldn't get money, or they were trying to get money from the Nixon administration to recapture Cuba. That was Frank's biggest plan. And Frank had written a list of names as to who would take over the Cuban regime and the new Cuban government, with Manuel Airtime being as president. And that list was given to my father. And my father told Liebengood that he could produce that list if he needed to. So there's a lot of things that my father told Liebengood behind closed doors. My father backed out of killing Nixon simply because killing a second president, I think, would have certainly raised a lot of red flags. And a lot of people would have investigated what happened other than the cover-up of Kennedy and his assassination.
Yeah,
So,
especially with all these same names in plain view. You know what I mean? The same names popping up over and over again. And it's not like they're fooling anybody.
Yeah, so basically, in a nutshell, my father backed out of assassinating Nixon And there was a time where all this came together because they were protesting the release of Orlando Bosch, who was in prison, who was in jail. And so my father, Frank, another group called Acción Cubana, and another group called Jure, Jure, all formed an alliance or came together and gathered 8 busloads of Cubans to travel in 1972 to Washington, D.C. and protest on the Capitol about the release of Orlando Bosch. And it was said that Nixon had came out to visit the anti-Castro Cubans who were camped out by the Lincoln Memorial. And basically people had told Nixon, that they wanted Orlando released, that they didn't want him in jail any longer. And this was a struggle going on between the Cuban community and getting Orlando Bosch released and the Nixon administration. So the official story is that Orlando served his time and they released him in December, I believe I can't remember, 70 something or another. I don't remember the exact date. But the true story is that there was the pressure of the anti-Castro Cubans and threatening Nixon on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial is what got Orlando Bosch released much sooner than finishing his sentence and for the crime he had committed.
And there was a plot against Kissinger as well?
There was a plot against Kissinger, and that plot I had not researched into much since Kissinger today is even still alive. But, I did not research too much of Kissinger's plot. I know that Frank was plotting his assassination. I know that word about, wanting to get rid of Kissinger because he wanted to open up relations with China. He got Nixon to do a lot of things that were opening up to communist regimes than trying to fight against communism at that time. And one thing that I guess the listeners really need to understand is that back in the 70s, communism was what they were fighting. They weren't fighting Fidel Castro, and they weren't fighting the Vietnam War per se, because the Vietnam War was being protested against by the BVAW in much of the United States and the young people back then. But the big war back in the 70s was all about communism. And so when Kennedy got assassinated, the first thing they started doing was blaming the Russians and that the Russians had did it. But LBJ wasn't open up to invade or fight Russia. And Russia was a very powerful country. So after that plot of blaming the Russians had failed, then they immediately started blaming Fidel Castro for the assassination. And the first thing that they did was say it was communists that were involved in Kennedy's assassination. That was the first thing that started circulating around in Miami, and the first stories ever told, because there was a war on communists. And what they wanted to do was recapture Cuba and open up the Cuban island or that Caribbean as a non-communist, non-dictator regime. And they had already made plans on invading Cuba on November 25th, 1963, just 2 or 3 days after the assassination. But it didn't happen.
So in your study of this, you believe the motive for the assassination of Kennedy was the Cuban motive?
The assassin wasn't just Cuban. It was communism as a whole. Simply because there was too much of Russia doing this and Russia moving into Cuba, Cuba doing that. And so too many people want to blame just one entity when they don't look at it as a whole, as it was communism that they were trying to fight at that time. It was all communism. It wasn't Fidel. It wasn't Khrushchev. It was communism.
Okay, and in the portions of the PDF that you sent me, the portions that I did get a chance to read, you talk about Johnson a lot. So you have a theory that Johnson was pivotal in this as well, correct?
Johnson's only involvement was covering it up. That's basically it. Bottom line, they tried to force Johnson into invading Cuba. Just a few days. See, they had already made. There were certain lawyers that a group of lawyers got together, and they were already declaring themselves as to who was going to be president, vice president, and secretary in a new government regime in Cuba on November 25th, 1963. And so, since they were trying to force President Johnson into invading Cuba, and it didn't happen, the invasion, of course, didn't happen. And just like the CIA tried to force Kennedy into using American military power in the Bay of Pigs, but it didn't happen. Kennedy specifically made himself clear that no American military would be used. But he also told the brigade that there would be air cover. And he also said that there would be not only air cover, but, A-4 Skyhawks were going to protect the B-26s that were flying in from Nicaragua. It didn't happen. Kennedy had called it off. In fact, he had McBundy call the CIA and told him to stand down. So it didn't happen. And so a lot of things just didn't happen after killing Kennedy. And, although that they tried, and there was plot after plot, plan after plan to get Cuba invaded, and because Cuba was the only country in this world that was communist on the Western Hemisphere. That was the only country, and it was too close to home. So Watergate happened. And what Watergate was really about was getting funds from the Nixon administration to invade Cuba, to recapture Cuba and free it. But basically, in a nutshell, these guys got greedy. And new cars were bought, bills got paid, food on the table, and money started circulating around in Miami, and nothing was really set aside to recapture Cuba or pay anybody to help infiltrate Cuba.
So many people think that the motivation for Watergate was the Modine and the Madam's book and all that kind of stuff like that, and you don't believe in any of that?
No. There's too many stories that started circulating. And I sat down and had a heart-to-heart conversation with Eugenio Martinez, knowing my father and Frank has even opened up to Leaving Good in some of the Leaving Good documents, as well as so did my father. And they discussed what Watergate was about. And see, it was about to set up the Democratic Party. It was about bribing the Democratic Party for funds. They were going to set up George McGovern, and they said that they had a tape of McGovern dealing in drugs with Fidel Castro, and they were going to use that tape against McGovern if he was going to be president-elect. But it didn't happen. And so they were going to set up Ted Kennedy, and they were going to put speakers and microphones in his office and also do the same thing with Ted Kennedy's secretary. But that didn't happen. But see, a lot of things that didn't happen is the reason why the full story hadn't come out, and people look at the broader picture of what was really going on. And it was always the Democratic Party that was getting targeted. And the reason why they were targeting the Democratic Party was because they wanted to dig up dirt on everybody and anybody in that party to bribe them for money, for funds. At the same time Watergate was going on, there was a plot or a plan called the Sunward Plan. And that was named after a ship called the Sunward Ship that was just off the coast of Cuba and heading back to where it came from. And that plot was to commandeer that ship and keep everybody hostages. And this was a plan from my father and Frank. And they were recruiting men to go out there and hijack that ship at high seas. And there was people from, I don't know, maybe 16 to 20 different countries. And they were going to bribe or hold them hostage and have these countries pay a ransom on all these people. But they couldn't recruit enough people to commandeer a ship because there was more people than there were men that were recruited. So that plan was scrubbed. That was just 3 days prior to the arrest on June 17, 1972. Now, all of this had to do with money. And this is what I've been trying to tell people. Watergate was nothing but a well-oiled fundraising campaign that they tried to get Nixon to pay millions of dollars out of his administration to anti-Castro groups so they could go in and reinvade Cuba. But Nixon stopped paying. And once Nixon stopped paying, he paid a little over $300-something thousand, $325,000, whatever the number was. But once he stopped paying, that's when they took out Nixon.
And who's
without having to fire a shot.
And who's your source for that information?
Eugenio Martinez, people that I spoke to in Florida.
Okay. Let me ask you a question. It's always fascinated.
It's also leaving good documents.
Yeah. Like one of the questions I've always had, because here you got these guys, you got Liddy, you got Sturgis, you got Hunt. These are such serious men, and okay, they're in this building and they're doing this burglary, they're doing a job, and a couple of cops show up. Why would these guys care about a couple of cops? Like, why wouldn't they, you know what I mean? Like, why would they surrender without a fight?
I have no idea.
No one does.
I think maybe because the security guard had called the police once he had discovered the tape that McCord placed back on the doors a second time around after removing the tape the first time, after the security guard had removed the tape the first time. So, I mean, these guys did a lot of stupid things. Now, either they were stupid things or they were things that were done intentionally to tie Nixon to Watergate, to have him be removed from office because he had stopped paying his bills.
Okay, because I find it hard to believe that they would just give up without a fight. Oh, didn't have badges that they could pull out immediately. Hey, we're doing an operation here. These are such serious guys involved in so much. The official story just doesn't seem to add up. Now, is there anything you want to add to the whole Watergate story that we haven't heard?
Well, I believe I touched on the subject of what Luis Posada told me about Watergate. I've already opened up as to who the sixth burglar was in Watergate. I can't think of anything else unless you have a question for me.
Yeah, the thing is, because I know you wanted to do this interview because you had information you want to share with us about a conversation you had with Luis Posada. What was that?
Well, basically, Luis told me who it was that went to Chicago to go steal the ID badge, a Secret Service ID badge, in 1962 that was used in Dallas, Texas, and given to Bernard Barker.
Gotcha. Okay, gotcha. And so that's the new information that you had.
That's the information that I was told by Luis Posada, yes.
Okay, fascinating. And Posada died a happy man. Posada, as a matter of fact, died of old age, a man who shot down airplanes.
Died at the age of 90. He had throat cancer.
Right. And a guy who had bombed airliners, right? And Jeb Bush actually named a day in Florida, Luis Posada Day. They gave him his own day.
Yeah, he during the last few months of his death, he had finally confessed his sins. And he knew he was dying. He had cancer. He knew he didn't have much to live. I just happened to be at the right place at the right time. And I had visited Luis once before in his apartment in South Kendall. But the other times that I had met up with him, I had met with him and Frank Castro at Luis's other place where he lived in the Doral Country Club. And so I just been at the right place at the right time when Luis decided to, really open up about a lot of the things that he did in his past life. He did admit to being a part of the plan or the plot to, he didn't put the bomb on the plane, but he is the one that helped create the bomb.
Right.
And he drew up plans on a piece of paper. He admitted to being a part or participant in bombing the Cuban airliner in 1976 with Orlando Bosch. He was in DICEP, D-I-S-P, and he was head of that in Venezuela. And he tortured a lot of people there. He opened up and admitted to that. The reason he was head of DICEP in Venezuela was it was an intelligence gathering information to find out Castro's travels and where he would be going in South America if he did travel. And the reason for that was because they were plotting Castro's assassination, and head of DICEP meant that you already knew what was going on, and in all intelligence gathering, all information would be going directly to you. It's like being head of DICEP or DICEP, however you want to pronounce it, is like DCI and the CIA. So you know exactly what's going on. And it was an intelligence gathering information to find out Castro's travels to plot his assassination. But Castro never traveled. That was the bad thing. And so they couldn't get the information they needed to find out where he would be next to assassinate him. So what they did was they bombed his airline in the hopes it would create a war between the United States and Cuba. Everything they did in the hopes of creating a war between the United States and Cuba. And so they were always trying to generate wars, whether it was blowing up an airplane or blowing up buildings in Cuba. And Fidel Castro knew it was the CIA's participants, members of the CIA, blowing up these buildings in Havana. Castro wouldn't bite. He wouldn't attack the United States, and the United States wouldn't attack Cuba. But everything that happened or conspired throughout the years, from the time of assassinating Kennedy all the way up through Watergate, to bombing an airplane in Cuba, to bombing hotels in Havana, and assassinating even members of the Castro regime in different embassies and blowing up Cuban embassies throughout the world, it was all based on generating a war between the United States and Cuba. But neither side bite or would start a war or create a war. So that's basically it in a nutshell.
Okay, several times in the interview you mentioned your PDF called "Assassins: A Man Without a True Story," "A Man Without a Country: A True Story." Where can people find that for free?
You can go to the Deep Politics Forum. I believe you would have to register as a member.
Okay.
I believe the Deep Politics Forum had been started by Peter Dale Scott. I don't know who started it, but I know that Peter Dale Scott is one of the members or founding member of that forum. And you'll have to request to become a member of that forum. And all you got to do is type in it or search for it, "Assassins: A Man Without a Country."
Now, the foreword is written by Roger Stone.
Yes.
What's your relationship with Roger Stone?
Well, Roger and I had talked many times. It was even prior to him writing his book on Nixon secrets. And one day he and I had just started communicating over the phone. And he had told me he had news that Liebengood had told him about the assassination plot. And I thought that was like really remarkable, because once I heard that, I had told Roger, well, not only did you probably hear about it from Liebengood, but I also have documents on that. And, would you want to use these documents in your book? And he said, absolutely, because it will only corroborate my story. And so I gave the documents to, oh my God, I can't think of his name right now, Roger Stone. I gave the documents to Roger and through via email, and then we had met in Dallas, Texas, at one of the JFK annual events that they have going on over in Dallas, Texas every year. And I had met Richard Nixon's second cousin, Tyler Nixon. And I had already known St. John Hunt prior to seeing him. I've seen him many times in the past. We've talked on the phone, so I've spoken to St. John Hunt. And so it was like a group of us getting together, sharing our stories and corroborating on what it is that we found in different documents and stories that either were told to us or we knew about that we shared with one another.
Let me ask you a question, because now your personal politics, because I believe you're a supporter of Trump.
No, and yes.
Okay.
Because yes, I think that there are some things that I agree with, but no, I don't fully support him, because I in my mind's eye, I think he's a complete idiot. I don't know. There's some things that he says that don't make sense.
Yeah.
And then there are other things that he does say that does make sense. And I'm still waiting on Mexico to actually fund the wall.
Yeah. Because my question is, because Trump seems to be at war with the deep state, with the FBI and the CIA forces, the old Bush,
Well, Trump is Trump, and he's not like Obama or Clinton or any of these other presidents that we've had in the past, because nobody's going to run Trump. See, you have to understand that Trump being a CEO and ran a company that his father also started many years ago, he's always been his own boss. He didn't allow people. He's not used to having people tell him what to do. He's used to telling people what they should do. And so him being president and being backed in a corner with Congress right now is not, I don't think it's something that Trump is very used to.
And fascinating, too, because I know you mentioned Roy Cohn a few times in your book and Trump's relationship with Cohen. It's a small world. You know what I'm saying? Let me ask you one last question here, because I got a little note from James Hunt, the nephew of Sturgis, as we were talking. And he said that at one time you accused Frank of killing your father, but then later on you told him.
I still accuse him.
Okay, that's what I was going to say, because you told me you still think so, but he seems to think that you apologized to him and that you didn't think that Frank did kill your father.
I never apologized to him.
Okay, all right.
I've never, ever apologized to him. And I've never said that I don't think that Frank didn't kill my father. I know that, people had tried to put in my head that in the beginning, people in Miami tried to put in my head that Fidel Castro is who killed my father. Because there was a guy by the name of Richard Cabrera, Carberar, something like that. It's Richard Cabrera, and he went by the nickname of Cayo, Cayo. He was a high-level G2 agent that had infiltrated many anti-Castro groups. In fact, he was second or third in charge of the G2. And Richard was the kind of guy that bragged about meeting directly with Fidel Castro at the airport, or a Jeep would pick up Richard at the airport. He would meet Fidel Castro and tell him what's going on in Miami. Well, long story short, Richard had become close to my father. And in one of the CIA or FBI documents, Richard admits being scared of my father, being terrified of my father. But he, as a G2 agent, was a double agent. He played both sides. See, he worked for the CIA, but he also reported back to Fidel Castro. So he was a high-level paid G2 agent for the Castro regime who had infiltrated my father's group. So they made it sound as if Fidel Castro had killed my dad. And they made it sound like, well, there was this guy who is obsolete. We couldn't recognize him. We didn't know what he did, but he was a Cuban, and he's the one that pushed your dad into the hole. Well, later, as time went on, people got to know me in Miami, and I became closer to them. And as I became closer to them, they opened up to me, and we became friends. Like the person who I became closest with was Tony Caladayu, who was very close to my dad, and he was the head of a group called RACE, R-E-C-E. He was one of the leaders of that anti-Castro group. And Tony told me plain out that it was Frank Sturgis who killed my father. And he had every reason to, because he was showing photographs that he should have never been showing around in Miami. But that was his get out of jail card, or his free get out of jail card, because every time he was booked in jail, my dad would go to jail, even for Watergate, he was booked under an alias name, like Ed Newman. And when they had him on so many different charges, somebody always in the CIA got my dad out of prison or jail. He never went to prison because of the photos that he had. When my dad went to Israel, he was pushed into a plot to assassinate the Prime Minister of Israel in 1976. Well, this I know for a fact that he had taken those photos in his briefcase, and he had buried them before he left for Israel in our backyard underneath our avocado tree. I know that for a fact because I saw him do it outside my bedroom window. So these were photos that he always kept close to him, never out of his sight, but nowhere where anybody could get to them. and they needed those photos. And Frank picked up my father that day for work with Richard Poyle. Richard Poyle is another character, and he was involved in a lot of things. He was also CIA. So, I just put two and two together, and in my heart of hearts, I know that Frank pushed my dad. I know that if he didn't push him, they killed him and they broke his neck and laid him on the floor. Right. They tortured him. But they got the photographs and they got his briefcase, his attaché case, the day he was dead. And in fact, my mother asked for his briefcase and asked the police department and even paid for 12 photographs of where they had killed him to the Miami Beach Police Department, and she only received 6, and nobody knows where the briefcase is.
Mm. Okay. One more thing, too. I have some note here. I'm not sure what context it's in, but what do you know about Felix Rodriguez and Kiki Camarino? Do you know anything about that?
Felix is pissed off at me.
Okay.
He won't talk to me. He's a little mad at me because I showed him a photograph of him sitting around a table with a bunch of guys that he calls drug dealers that I assume were a bunch of men from Op 40, but they were also drug dealers. This was a picture of Barry Seal and Felix Rodriguez and members of different groups that were sitting at a table. And when I showed Felix that photo, he got mad at me and told me he never wanted to talk to me again. And I tried to explain to him several times that that photo was given to me by an author who wrote the book Burying the Boys.
Yeah, Daniel Hopsicker.
Yeah. And I got the photo from him. I said, listen, Felix, if I offended you, I'm sorry, but he won't talk to me. Who else did you name?
Kiki Camarino.
That was Kiki. Wasn't he
the DEA agent who was killed?
The brother of Rolando Mansfer?
No, the Kiki Camarino was the DEA agent that was killed down there in Mexico.
The DEA agent that Felix had him killed.
Right.
Yeah. There's a lot of things that Felix won't talk to me about.
Okay. All right. So is there anything, because I know you were saying that this would be your last interview. You wanted to, did you get everything out you wanted to talk about?
There is just so much to talk about. There's just so much to say. But like I said, everything that I can think of is in my PDF.
Okay.
I just opened up in my PDF, and there's like over 300 pages with FOIA documents and pictures and testimonies and recordings and all kinds of stuff. So to get everything out would probably require a week interview, and we don't have that much time. But there are over 300 pages of reading in that PDF, and everything that I needed to say, wanted to say, is in that PDF.
Okay, and I would like to give you the opportunity, if there ever is something else you want to get off your chest that you want to share with the audience, you're always welcome to come back. Just let me know. We'll put you right back on the air.
No, I think that this is going to be my last.
Okay.
I'm not going to do it, because I want to go back to a normal life.
Yes.
And just enjoy the rest of my life as a retired person and not think about this anymore. I've had enough sleepless nights.
Yeah, I can't blame you for that. I can't blame you for that at all. Scott, thank you so much. Scott Kaiser, thank you so much for your information. And once again, like I said, something you want to send me anonymous, whatever, you're more than welcome to always get back in contact, okay?
Okay, thank you so much, Ed.
Thank you again. Good night.
Good night.
Okay, there we had Scott Kaiser, the son of Edwin Benjamin Kaiser. Okay, you can check that out. He's published a few things on this, but he's kind of upset the way the publishing went, so he's not promoting it. But that one thing you could find on that, so you have to go back and look where he told you where to find this PDF. That's the one he seems to be happy with and would like to share with people. So that's available there. Scott Kaiser, thank you so much. Like he said, that's his last interview. He was looking for a platform to put this out. I think that we got some pretty good stuff out there on the record. So thank you so much, Scott Kaiser.